Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Marin Economic Briefing, the first economic briefing for the year of 2023. My name is Mike Blakely, and I'm the CEO of the Marin Economic Forum. We are a 501c3 public benefit nonprofit here in Marin County, providing research and advisory on the local and Bay Area economy. You can find out more about the work that we do and make sure that you subscribe to future events like this by visiting our website at marineconomicforum.org. Please pass the word to your friends that we have free content on our economy, and we share other studies and updates from other regions and interesting economic studies. So there's a lot of great content on there. Please subscribe and tell your friends. So these economic briefings are designed to be just that. They are a sort of 30-minute package of what we see going on at the global, national, local levels. Joining me, as always, is our chief economist, Dr. Rob Eiler, who is a well-known expert on the North Bay economy. And Rob and I frequently give these types of briefings around the county and other areas in North Bay. So we're pleased to do that with you this morning. We're going to be trying to talk a little bit about what we see happening this year, although if you're following any of the headlines, you know it's highly uncertain, highly unpredictable. So there's always that risk of trying to put your spin on things, but nonetheless, that's what we are here to do. So once again, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Eiler so we can get started. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks so much, and folks, thanks for coming this morning. So what I want to do over the next few minutes is I want to talk about where we're at as a national economy, and then talk about where we're at from a state and local economy, because we have some new data that have come out in terms of a forecast for the California economy, just to kind of give some context about where Marin may be going on top of the national picture. So this is the evolution of jobs in the United States by major industry sector, looking back to January 2020 as a pre-pandemic benchmark. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move through this relatively quickly, because the story is relatively well known in the sense that we knew April and May 2020 were the big cuts. By the end of 2021, we'd seen a couple of industries recover the jobs lost as a result of the pandemic, primarily transportation and warehousing and professional services. And then by the end of December, which is not necessarily the annualized look, but at least is where we are seasonally adjusted at the end of 2022, almost every industrial sector in the United States has recovered. Now, there are some very outstanding exceptions if we look to the far right. And so real quick, I should provide some context. When we show labor data like this, the way to think about it, because it's ordered this way, is the left-hand side that starts with construction starts with goods producing businesses and then moves into services. So you can kind of see that moving left to right. Construction, durable goods manufacturing, non-durable goods manufacturing are the primary goods producers. Those tend to have larger multiplier effects. So we want to see those jobs grow, and then those jobs and their workers spending spread their wings into other services. Now, the United States also happens to be very heavy on services like information or tech and business and professional services. And you can see that those have also grown. It's the far right-hand side, which are more so-called personal services, that are still lingering in negative levels with respect to where the total number of people working in the United States in those industry sectors were before the pandemic, thinking of, again, January 2020 as a pre-pandemic benchmark. Hotels and motels, or what we call accommodation in some, still down about 1 out of 7 jobs. So what's tricky about that, as well as food services and drinking places, basically bars or restaurants or anywhere that you eat out of your house, those numbers being negative really tell a tale about how easy it is for new high school graduates, even people in college, or older workers who are in transition between one job or another. Those are generally very easy entry positions. But if business models have changed and they're using less workers, that might be something that would extend unemployment bouts, if you want to put it that way. When someone loses their job, that duration of unemployment being extended means a more slow recovery from recession, just simply because we don't have those industries hiring at the same pace. So watch for that over time, and I'll come back and talk about this when we talk about Marin County in a minute. Biggest question on most people's minds still is inflation. These data are what we call core personal consumption expenditures prices. So in a nutshell, what that means is you take a shopping cart, you fill it with everything you buy at home every month, but you pull food and energy, goods and services back out of that shopping cart, which converts that shopping cart from the total to core. And we look back 1 year and say, how much more did that shopping cart cost this month in percentage terms versus 1 year ago. That's the number that's the November 4.7%. It says that, well, that shopping cart cost 4.7% more than it did in November 2021 as of November 2022. But that inflation rate, this is one way that we measure inflation. I'll tell you why we show this one in just a second, has been wobbling down from the heights in early 2022 for most of last year. So these data generally are about 6 or 8 weeks old when they're reported. But the point is that that solid blue line shows two stories. One, it shows that from 2007 forward on a monthly basis, we had a very, very slow, steady, like almost a utopian way of inflation evolving from a central banking standpoint. And then we saw a wild spike after the end of the initial time of the pandemic and the real seizure of supply chains started to show their face on top of having major fiscal and monetary expansion accommodating each other in late 2020 and most of 2021. The Federal Reserve then increased interest rates in early 2022, and we've been getting some of that taming of inflation ever since. The reason I showed this one and not the CPI, or the so-called consumer price index, is because these are the exact data that the so-called Federal Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve, that body of the Federal Reserve that decides on interest rates, uses to determine whether or not increasing interest rates is actually having what they're looking at as the effect of rising interest rates on the American economy and inflation. Those red dots are where the Federal Reserve wants the solid blue line to go. And that blue dotted line is basically where the Federal Reserve wants to keep inflation expectations in, let's say, the medium term. So think of 2-year inflation expectations being around 2%. So you might have a little bit of spike here and there, but you really want that solid blue line to wobble around that dotted blue line, almost as if it is the average over time. And so the conundrum that the Federal Reserve faces is that they are still at relatively high inflation rates. We have relatively high interest rates, and whether or not it's going to take this sort of, let's say, 9 or 12-month lag time for everything the Federal Reserve did in 2022 to finally have an effect on these prices going into 2023. But the current forecast, which are those red dots through that shaded area, is so far so good. You can actually see that the blue line crossed that first dot at the end of 2022. So we'll see. But what's important is actually what's coming up. So will we see interest rate stability and then maybe even see a fade of interest rates later in the year? And there's some financial forecasters out there starting to form that picture of this year. But at the end of the day, what we're hoping for is that that inflation rate continues to slide down and the Federal Reserve starts taking the foot off the gas a little bit with interest rate increases. We'll see how that goes. The second thing is to think that the high interest rates and the lingering inflation is probably going to have some cutback on housing markets. I'll show you at the very end a housing market forecast that suggests that things are slowing down. And we should have figured that. Right now, most forecasters are thinking somewhere in California between 10 and 15% give back from relative highs in 2022. So that's not terrible, especially if you made 40 or 45% on your house the last 3 years. But watch for more and more concerns around prices falling in housing markets, because we tend to ignore prices increasing because we think that that's the way it should work. And we get very concerned when prices go down regardless of the relative sizes. Third is that we're already starting to see this. We should expect more job losses and more relatively large announcements from large employers around the United States. So tech, if you've been watching the news, major tech firms have been starting to shed jobs, and we kind of expected that they overhired in the initial cases, and now they're starting to kind of come back to a medium or more long-term norm. Watch how that then moves back or ripples back into transportation and logistics, because that industry probably also somewhat overhired in the short term, especially if business and consumer spending starts to slide back a little bit, and retail will probably follow right behind that. So that's where you should see the initial job losses and a lot of maybe initial concern about whether or not we're starting to slide into recession. But I'll talk more about that in just a second. If we think about where the Federal Reserve is now, what this is a quarterly straw poll of the members of the Federal Open Market Committee. It says, where do you think things are going to be at the end of next year, which is 2023 now, by the end of this year now, 2024, 2025, and what sort of a hand-wavy longer run? Well, those dots tell that tale. So you can see that for 2023, those dots all except for 2 live above 5%. And I'll tell you why that's important in just a second. But then in 2024 and 2025, those interest rates start to slide down toward, again, what you think of as a longer run norm. And so this is sort of feeding the idea, because this graph also comes directly out of the Federal Reserve's report when they meet, and this one comes right out of the December report, is this meant to do what's called forward guidance. It kind of tells the world, hey, the Federal Reserve thinks we're going this direction, so we want you to start making financial decisions both at home and as businesses and as investors that way, thinking this is the direction we're going. So this kind of forms the credibility puzzle that we've been trying to solve for some time with respect to interest rates and where policy rates may ultimately be going. Now, why that's important is the following. That was the path in September 2021 of where they thought things would be in 2023 and where we needed to go. So they did not expect interest rates to rise very quickly. We are currently here. So that red dot is where now we're going to probably see that ascend into that cloud of blue dots in 2023 and then start to see that fade. But the three things to consider are how much of an increase in interest rates is enough. Two, if recession happens, or let's say that the economy contracts more than expected by the Federal Reserve, will we see interest rates slide faster? And then ultimately, what is the goal? And this is, I think, the critical part to think about. The goal ultimately is not to cure current inflation, but to support current inflation expectations. Because if inflation expectations start to increase above 2%, remember that blue dotted line we saw in the last graph, if that starts to slide up, that will slow down spending by businesses and consumers, and may also distort investor expectations and their own sort of investment forecasts in such a way that we just see slower growth in the economy. So it's not inflation today, it's in the expectations that businesses and consumers are making looking forward that's really the critical factor in terms of what the Federal Reserve is trying to do. And that's why you're sort of seeing this kind of get down to that longer run norm. Okay. So this is the latest forecast. These numbers are actually from November 2022. In the first 3 quarters of 2022, we're going to get the fourth quarter next week in terms of the first estimate of what happened in that fourth quarter with respect to real GDP. Looked like this. So the first 2 quarters, we actually had what was called technical recession because 2 negative quarters in a row. In other words, we had negative growth of income after inflation, which we kind of call as a phrase, real GDP growth. And then the third quarter, we saw a pretty good bump back up in positive. So we rid ourselves of the belief we were in recession in 2022. We have not had a declared recession yet. Part of that's because of the labor market, which I'll talk about in just a minute in a little more detail. But that is the latest forecast about where we're going the next few years. So in November 2022, they said, okay, by the end of the year, we should actually pick up from the previous 4 quarters forecast, which is the column that's not shaded just to the left of that shaded column that says previous. Went from 1.6 to 1.9, but the 2023 forecast almost got halved from 1.3 to 0.7. So the number's not negative for 2023, but it suggests that this is going to be a slow slog of a year. We kind of already knew that. We're going to see some pickup in unemployment. Now you can see that in the second sort of column of forecasts, and I should have given a little more context. Every quarter, the Federal Reserve in Philadelphia interviews 40 forecasters and says, what do you think is going to happen to 3 major macro variables: real GDP growth, unemployment, and that same core PCE inflation we saw before. So that second shaded area is the unemployment rate looking forward a few years. And you can see from the previous quarter's forecast, 2023, 24, and 25 have all picked up. So we should expect a little bit more lift of unemployment. I'll talk about why that might be the case in just a second when we talk about Marin County. And then there's those same red dots here we saw on that previous graph. But the bottom line is the following, is that while we did see a couple of negative quarters of real GDP in 2022, there's a little math trick that economists use, which is you take what happened from last quarter to this quarter, multiply that percentage change by 4, and that's your so-called annualized change that you get reported out as what happened this last quarter, with respect to real GDP. If you actually look at what happened truly 1 year ago, GDP in the United States has grown for 7 quarters in a row, but that growth is fading. So another reason why we have not had recession declared yet, even though we had so-called technical recession the first 2 quarters of 2022, is because the growth of the economy in true annualized sense has been positive, and those growth numbers are relatively small vis-a-vis previous recessions when we've had declared recessions about 6 months after we've seen 2 quarters of negative growth. So keep all that in mind. The bottom line at the national level is the 2 things. 1, we should expect at least 2 more interest rate hikes of 0.25% each in the first quarter of 2023, with the idea that that'll be the final stand, more or less, of the Federal Reserve. We might see a little bit more than that if inflation still doesn't want to move through those red dots we saw on the other graph, but all indicators are we're looking at probably 0.5% more to go up, basically moving that red dot real close to where that blue dot cloud was, and then we're going to start to see a fade after 2023. Second is that this year is going to be a slow growth year, and whether we have recession declared or not, assume it is going to be a much slower year economically with an increase in job losses. Okay, well, let's look at California. These data came out from the Department of Finance and accompanied the governor's budget a couple of weeks ago. This is a look at the labor force. And so I actually took the numbers and I indexed them in 2019, right before the pandemic, at 100. So you can see that the 2010s was a slow, steady run up, about 5.5% growth from the bottom after the Great Recession, peaked in 2019, fell during the pandemic, and has just actually crossed the threshold of recovering all the jobs that were lost in the aggregate in California at the end of 2022 and going into 2023. And you can see the evolution of the labor force there. And I'm sorry, this is actually the jobs growth. So now that's a little bit more clear. And that's the forecast after 2022 in terms of where jobs and labor force is going. So two items here. Department of Finance is assuming that we will see people re-enter the labor force that have not been counted for maybe the last 18 months. And that's going to start to pick up the number of available workers. That's the orange line. The black line is the number of people working at a job in California. And you can see that from between 2022 and 2023, the growth is flattened out a little bit. So the supposition is that we're going to see somewhat less fast-paced growth in 2022, maybe not in the aggregate a reduction in jobs, but a slower pace of job growth over the next few years after we get through this year. So Department of Finance is not assuming that we're going to have job cuts in 2022 as much as more people who are now available for work, meaning that kick up of the labor force. And that basically holds over this forecast horizon toward 2026. If you look at Marin County and what's happened since the pandemic, this is the evolution of the labor force, and this is the evolution of, I'm sorry, that's blue is employment and black is labor force. So we've had this wild movement of both available workers that live in Marin County and people working. And it's been slow to get back to that 100 line. Same deal, I started them both at 100. Now, why this is important is because Marin County happens to be a place like a lot of suburban California around the Bay Area, where when the pandemic hit, people not only probably moved away a little bit from Marin County and also Sonoma and Napa counties. We know the populations have been reduced, but have also maybe gone into a mode where they're now self-employed. And it's important to think about this because what the labor data were reported out by EDD do not tell us are the self-employed numbers. So if you lost a payroll job or had to walk away from it for childcare reasons in, let's say, mid-2020, and you opened up your own business, or you're a consultant now because you were working as a professional service provider before the pandemic, you're not going to be counted in these data, and you're going to be removed from that labor force. It doesn't mean you're not working, doesn't mean you're not generating income. But as economists, we do not do a good job in counting those things parallel in real time. We do an okay job in figuring out how many people are on payroll, not a good job in people who are self-employed. That lags about 2 years, unfortunately. So reconciling that for a place that's relatively small, and Marin County is a relatively small place at the end of the day when you think nationally, and how that might determine how strong or weak the economic recovery and ultimately economic expansion will be on the other side of 2023 is tricky in Marin County. But we still have a little bit of work to do, and some of this has got to be retirements, population change, and people becoming self-employed. That mix is all there. The proportions are what are still a mystery. Now, if you look at the industrial sector, I'm just going to run to the punchline here because the evolution in Marin County is somewhat similar to the US initially, but you can see there's more negative industries here than at the US level. And a lot of that for Marin County is just simply, again, shifts in not only the county population, but the regional population from which Marin County's employers draw their workforce. It's been tough to rehire. If you look at the far right-hand side, we have leisure and hospitality, which is taking accommodation, hotels, motels, places to stay overnight, bars and restaurants, event centers, jamming them all into one industry, down almost 1 in 5 from before the pandemic. So one of the things we're doing now is trying to see whether or not business models have changed. And you probably know a restaurant that has slowed down the number of hours that it's open, the number of people that are hired, the number of tables that are in there. They've just sort of changed their business model with the idea that they're trying to reduce cost and trying to regain as much of the revenue they can from that they had before the pandemic. If that model, so that it looks at 20% or 19.5 negative, looks relatively large, but it's just simply saying, well, if I had 5 people working in that shift, now I have 4. That's a big deal in the sense if you don't intend to rehire, where do our high school kids go when they're thinking about what to do next with their lives? Where do our college students go when they're trying to generate income to get through college? Where do older workers go? There's a lot of workforce development questions that lie within these numbers from Marin County. Again, assuming that these are truly reflective of what's going on after you take self-employment into account. Self-employment, though, is not going to be in things like leisure and hospitality, other services, or government. It's going to be more in professional services, finance, information, which includes tech. And then we're going to get back into where there will be less self-employment except for construction. And you can see construction has been a real strength for Marin County. The housing market has helped. However, let's talk briefly about the housing market to wrap up. As part of the governor's budget, the Department of Finance also puts forward not only an employment forecast, but also a forecast for the evolution of housing units. So these data I'm showing you from 2002 rather than 2010, because I want to show you the pop up of single family homes, the deep dive that took place in this sort of slow, flat movement to just about 310 or 315,000 units on an annualized basis, sort of as a rolling sum over 5 years looking forward. So the idea is every 5 years, you're getting about another 315,000 single family units. And then that's the evolution of multifamily. So multifamily had a pretty good run in the 2010s, and then it may be slowing down a little bit and then picking up toward the middle of this decade. But the point is that on a 5-year rolling sum, will we get more housing units? Hence, will we get more housing affordability as a result of increasing supply on the new side? Right now, the forecast is not for much change in the total number of housing units being built than was there more or less right as the pandemic began. So we need to watch about how affordable housing arguments, workforce housing arguments, whether or not we've had enough houses built or not built, and changing the cost of housing tend to evolve through the middle of this decade. Now, where we're at now in terms of a housing market forecast is purely to buy. The latest forecast is through November 2023. You can see that only a couple of counties now, Imperial and Kings, are really the only 2 counties in California that have a positive forecast that are followed. California for the next 12 months is down about 3% for now. This should continue to roll down closer to 10 over the next few months. And you can see Marin County is at 4.6 and places like Santa Clara County are down at 7%. We just have to assume we're going to have some contraction. So 6-8 months ago, all of these were positive forecasts, but because of interest rates rising, slower economy prediction, and starting to see job losses specifically centered on the Bay Area. And if you look at the far right-hand side, a lot of those are Bay Area or tangentially related to the Bay Area. We're starting to see some comeback of prices. So when you look forward, you've got to expect that in Marin County, we're going to see probably some slower growth in hiring, maybe more people losing their jobs, especially if they're related to the tech industry in the Bay Area and live in Marin County, and housing prices are going to come back somewhat. But it has been an amazing 3-year run in housing. It has been a pretty good recovery, and we still have a relatively hot job market. It's still hard to hire and find workers. The trick now is how we evolve over the next year or year and a half or so, and how especially our small businesses come out on the other side, because those cost increases from inflation, to kind of wrap it all back up to the beginning, are not necessarily going away, especially rising wages. So our small businesses are the one that are most risk if we see any kind of economic contraction or actually declared recession. So watch for that in terms of both economic and workforce development going forward. So with that, thank you so much, folks, for coming today, and I'll hand it back over to Mike.
Rob, thanks so much. And to our audience, as you can see, each one of these topics that Rob discussed could be a briefing in and of itself. And that's why I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter, because we are addressing these, we're drilling down on these issues and sending out, weekly, monthly communications. You can follow us on LinkedIn. We're trying to get as much content on these topics out there because it's just that difficult to really understand, and it changes rapidly. So I want to point back to, speaking of communications, a blog post that I wrote last week talking about the cyclical and structural changes that we're now seeing in the marine economy resulting from the pandemic. We're now 3 years into this, so we start to have enough quantitative and qualitative evidence of what's really happening. So one of the structural changes, and if you think about the labor force issue, is that there's really little likelihood that the labor force is going to come back to the point of what it was pre-pandemic. Why? Well, there's a couple of things going on. First of all, Rob talked about, the different reasons why people may have opted out of the workforce, but you have to also understand that employers are now adapting to not only what was a hard hiring environment, but they're also realizing that one of the structural changes is there's been a real focus on job benefits, especially for low-wage workers. So we've got a lot of initiatives coming down the pike on wages, right? The county of Marin is looking at an $18 wage, a minimum wage. So there's a lot of pressure on the benefits that employers are going to be having to provide to workers. And for some employers, that's just too much to deal with. And they're trying to do more with less. They're either adapting in a way where they can automate, or they're just simply trying to do more labor with less people, because employees in some fashion can be challenging for employers. But the other thing is on the consumer side, on the demand side, we're now starting to see and hear from businesses, particularly those that are doing the in-person locally serving services, the demand has just not returned. Despite vaccinations and boosting and a relatively safe health environment, we're not seeing demand come back. And what I said in the very beginning of this was the marine economy was going to be based on, recovery was going to be based on a resumption of consumption. The American consumer is very strong. That is one of the key reasons why we have inflation, but the consumption of services, local services in Marin County has not returned, and we don't really know if it's going to. And so this is really an issue that if you start to project out and look about what could this impact be, we might be seeing potentially a shrinking of the locally services, the non-tradable services market in Marin County. And I'm talking about a simple example of perhaps you're not going to see as many coffee shops and restaurants, or may not be as many fitness studios. There just might be a shaking out of what right now is a fairly saturated market. So this is not great news for the local downtowns that rely on a lot of these businesses, but it's a fact, and we're starting to see data now. The good news behind it is that there are a lot of businesses being created, and Rob talked about sole proprietors, which aren't really counted, but business license applications in Marin County were up in 2020, they were up in 2021, and we don't yet have the data for 2022, but I assume that they will be up as well. So there are businesses being started. Hopefully they are in sectors that are more related to tradable goods and services, meaning that they're sold outside of the county. We're not dependent just on the county consumer. So with that being said, we are at time, and I do want to thank everybody for tuning in. There's going to be more on this labor force issue coming out, so please watch your inboxes. But again, this is a major issue that we've been tracking for the last 6 months, and we do see some concern with it. For those of you that have put questions in the chat at this late date, we'll try to respond to those in the email that comes out later this afternoon with the recording of this. Thank you for those questions, and thank you everybody for tuning in. The year is going to be slower economically from what we can tell today, but certainly there's a lot of positives out there as well. And hopefully that starts with your sunny Monday here. So thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you next month.